Welcome, everybody. It's another one of our deeper inquiry sessions. These are our virtual activist meetups where we can dig deeper into topics that enthuse us. And for today's session on how to change your narrative, in the title taken from Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. So how do we change our narratives? There's a great quote by the Scottish writer Ali Smith that goes, every great narrative is at least two narratives, if not more. The thing that is on the surface, and then all the things underneath that are invisible. And we're very lucky to have Ellie O'Hagan with us here today. Ellie worked with Freedom, a nonprofit, on refugee messaging. And she's going to start off this session with different findings from this long and super interesting research on government messaging, on people's emotional responses to different words, to different framings of the issue on migration, on otherness, on identity, and the deeper things that get touched that we might not be aware of. Also, this kind of research is super important in letting us understand what our weaknesses are, how propaganda operates, how honest political messaging could work, and essential to healing some of the polarized narratives that we find on all sides of political spectra in all kinds of cultural contexts. And then afterwards, Ellie's going to share a little bit about the current work that she's spearheading with CLASS on race-class narrative analysis. And this is underway, so there's just going to be some early research and findings and inquiries. And yeah, and then hopefully we're going to go into some juicy conversation. So with no further ado, passing the baton to Ellie.
Thanks, Ivan, and thank you all for joining. And just on the language thing that Julia said, I'm British, so we can't speak any language other than English. So the fact that you can speak English at all is hugely impressive to British people. So yeah, just please remember that when you choose to speak. So I will start with the presentation that Ivan just mentioned. It's called Changing the Conversation on Refugees. As Ivan said, I carried this work out with Freedom from Torture, which is an NGO in this country that opposes the torture of refugees, and also refugees being returned to countries where they might be tortured. I did this as a freelance consultant before I became director of CLASS think tank, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So basically, we did this project because the right in this country is very good at demonizing refugees. And the way that they do that is they say, you know, we're okay with people coming in here who are genuine refugees, but the majority of refugees are not genuine refugees. They're just pretending so that they can come here and live in our housing and claim from the government. And this is, and the right in this country has been very, very successful in terms of public opinion on refugees. And so this research was really about addressing that. So I'm just going to talk you through it. So basically what we did was we surveyed 2,000 British people. It was a general population sample that we used, which means it was representative of everybody. We didn't screen anybody out, so everybody was joined in. And we asked our sample a series of questions, which basically were like, which statement do you like best, statement A or statement B? And everybody who chose statement A was segmented into base. And that means that they support refugee rights all day, every day. Doesn't matter how you say it. It doesn't matter who's saying it. They will always support refugee rights. So they're our base. They're always on our side. Persuadables, this is always the majority of people. These are people who don't really know what they think, who sort of swing from one side to the other and are persuaded by strong, decisive messaging. And that was 64% of people. And then the opposition, and this is a small group, and every country has an opposition on every political issue. And it's the small group of people who are ideologically opposed to your issue. And so in this case, 12% of the people in our sample were ideologically opposed to refugees being treated well. It didn't matter what we said or how we said it, these people never supported refugee rights. And what we say is the way that you win is you energize the base so that people in the base want to go out and spread your words and make the case with their family and friends. You want to persuade the persuadables, and you want to alienate the opposition. And the reason that you want to alienate the opposition is because it's two things. The first is, if you don't alienate the opposition, the only way that you keep them on side is by saying things that are bland and that aren't really progressive. They're just things that everybody could agree with. So in other words, you don't say anything. Or you say something that could be actively helpful to the opposition's narrative. So that's why it was really important for us that this small percentage of the population was alienated by what we were saying. So even though we segmented people by attitudes, we could learn some things about them. So this is in the UK. The base is more likely to be female, aged 35 to 54, more likely to live in Scotland or the Northeast in England, and more likely to be interested in current affairs, so the news and politics. People who were persuadable were equally likely to be male or female. They were aged between 18 and 34. They were more likely to live in London, and they were less likely to be interested in news and politics. And then the opposition, more likely to be male, aged 55 and over, more likely to live in Northern Ireland. Sorry, my computer's about to run out of battery. There we go. And or more likely to live in East and West Midlands if they were in England. And again, they were more likely to be interested in news and politics. So that again shows us that the opposition are ideological. They invest time and energy into not liking refugees. They're not people who just don't really know what they think and pick up unhelpful arguments. They really don't like refugees. And that's why we need to alienate them. So we asked people to choose between two statements, as I said, and that's what helped segment them. But we also learned a lot. We tested some things out by segmenting. So we learn a lot about how people talk, how people understand what we're saying about refugees. And one of the things that we wanted to test was the phrase safe and legal routes. British people in this call will know that the most popular phrase for refugee advocates to use is safe and legal routes. And this is how they say it: we must build safe and legal routes so that people can arrive in Britain safely. But it's also a phrase that Priti Patel, our Home Secretary, who's not a fan of refugees at all, uses as well. So we wanted to test, we knew this phrase hadn't been tested, and we wanted to test what people thought of when they heard it. And this is what we found, that nearly half of people think that when they hear the phrase safe and legal routes, that it means that we need to police our country's border so that people can only come in if they have the correct documentation. So what that means is this phrase, which is the most popular phrase about refugee rights, is essentially, when you use it, you're essentially tossing a coin and hoping that the people that you're speaking to are hearing what you want them to hear. They are nearly equally likely to hear something that is really damaging to your cause. So the first thing we thought was, don't use that phrase anymore. We also wanted to test how nationalism affects people's opinions of refugees. Because there's a few pro-refugee, pro-migration organizations in the UK that often appeal to people through talking about patriotism and nationalism. And we wanted to see what effect that has. So we basically summed up our message, which is we should do the right thing and treat people who are fleeing danger with compassion. And then we summed up the opposition's message, which is basically genuine refugees must seek asylum in other countries and not break the law by coming to Britain illegally. And we tested those two things against each other. But with our message, we put at the start, as British people, we should do this, that, and the other. And what we found is that in this, when you use the phrase as British people, that just over half of people are more likely to support the opposition than us. So then we changed it to as caring people, and everything else was kept the same. And when we did this, we found that people were more likely to support refugee rights by 6 points. Why is that? Well, we think that's because when you hear caring, you think about compassion, you want to see yourself as a caring person. And, it brings to mind shared humanity, care, love. These are the sort of ideas that come to mind when you hear the phrase caring people. But when you hear the word British people, it makes you think of the nation. So in Britain, at least, you think of an island with borders. You think of an in-group and an out-group. You think of speaking English. Maybe you even think of white skin. These are all things that are not associated with allowing a group of people to enter the country who we view as equal to ourselves and as part of our communities. And we think that is why it doesn't work as a way of leading into that conversation. We also wanted to test the current message that we're using, which isn't very good, against the opposition's message. We wanted to sort of go head to head. And I'm very good at communications, but I'm very bad at graphic design. So unfortunately, the full message is sort of cut off at the end there. But basically, the message we're currently using, we summarized it like this. It is nearly impossible to claim asylum in the UK without resorting to dangerous journeys. There is an urgent need for the Home Office to create safe and legal routes so that people can arrive here safely. And the opposition's message is, genuine refugees who have arrived in countries like France should claim asylum there, not risk their lives and break the law by coming to Britain illegally. So we tested those two against each other because obviously in real life, they are competing messages all the time. And we found that people overwhelmingly choose the opposition's message against ours when the two go head to head. So what we're saying at the moment isn't working. And then finally, we noticed that the refugee sector likes to talk a lot about the Home Office. That is the department, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you've figured out though, that's the department that deals with asylum applications in the UK. And it's amongst our sectors, it's known as being cruel, incompetent, not fit for purpose, and racist, basically. But in the public at large, we weren't sure whether they shared our view on that. I wasn't even sure whether they knew what the Home Office was. And yet so much of the communications advocating for refugee rights talks about the Home Office. So we asked which government department processes asylum applications. And we coded the answer so that people could say Home Office, they could take a guess, or they could say that they didn't know. And if they either said Home Office or Priti Patel, who is the Home Secretary, that their answer would be coded as right. Now, as it happened, nobody said Priti Patel. But what you can see here is just over half of people said the Home Office. The rest didn't know, or they guessed wrong. So again, we're in this situation where when you say the Home Office, you're tossing a coin and hoping that your audience just luckily understands what you're talking about. And if someone hears you who might be persuadable, but doesn't understand what the Home Office is, you are putting an unnecessary barrier of communication between you and that person. So we thought it's probably not a good idea to talk about the Home Office all the time. And I should mention that when we asked this question, we had already exposed participants to a message about the Home Office. So they were asked this question about 2 minutes after they'd just seen a piece of communications about the Home Office. And even then, only 51% of them got it right. So then we moved on to dial testing, and this is kind of what we found. So dial testing is where you read a 30-second message out, and the participant listens, and they use the arrows on their keyboard of their computer to indicate whether they like the message or not. So we showed them a sort of thermometer and asked them, if you like it, whether you feel warm to it or whether you feel cold to it. And we keep the message at 30 seconds because what we want to make sure is that people are not thinking consciously, that they're actually reacting instinctively, that they don't have time to sort of mull it over, because we want to understand what their instinctive reactions are. So this is what we're calling the status quo message. This is the message that the sector is currently using. We created this from putting a load of messages from different organizations together, and then we sent it to lots of people in the sector and asked them, is this a fair representation of what you say? And they said yes. So you can see there the light blue line. I won't read it out because it's quite long, but the light blue line is the base. The persuadables is the dark blue line, and the black line is the opposition. So I'll just summarize this. So the base loves that message, the opposition hates it, and just to spoil what's coming ahead, that was the case with every message. But it has no significant effects on persuadables. And interestingly, the most unpopular phrase with the persuadables is about safe and legal routes, which is another suggestion that we should be not using that phrase, even though it's the most popular phrase of the sector at the moment. And we found that this phrase, we only take 0.6 of the world's refugees, seems to create a spike. And the reason, as in people liked it. And the reason that we bring that out here is because there is some concern that what we're saying there is refugees are a burden. So isn't it good that we're taking so few of them? So it's not, so that was something that we wanted to hone in on and say, we should really figure out why people like this, because it might not be good for us. And finally, the opposition is less cold towards the phrase people fleeing war, torture and persecution. And I'll talk a bit about that in the next message. So then we tried a national pride message, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of organizations in the UK that want to appeal to people by talking about patriotism and nationalism. And again, the light blue line is the base, the dark one is the persuadables, and the black is the opposition. I'll just read this one out because I'll just let Gary in. So how we treat refugees is about who we are as a country. Britain is one of the richest countries in the world, and most British people believe in giving others a helping hand. We should set an example to the world, welcoming those who need sanctuary. Our asylum system should set the gold standard, reflecting our values of compassion and justice by processing all of those who arrive on our shores as quickly and fairly as possible, and ensuring those who need our help are able to rebuild their lives in safety and become part of our British communities. So again, base loves it, opposition hates it. Persuadables, they're all right about it. They're not moved particularly, but they're okay. You know, they move up a little bit. Everybody likes the phrase, how we treat refugees is about who we are. We think that's because it taps into values. And the opposition is less cold towards the phrase, welcoming those who seek sanctuary, which is similar to in the status quo message. And the reason we think that they like the opposition is less against that phrase is because it plays into right-wing politicians' habit of saying there are people who are genuinely in need of sanctuary, and then there are all of the other people who are lying. And then finally, the base likes the phrase part of our British communities, and that will become relevant in a bit. So then we tested a golden rule message, which is treat others how you want to be treated. Sorry. So this is what it says: no matter what we look like or where we come from, most of us treat others the way we'd want to be treated. If any of us feared for our lives or for our loved ones, we would want to know that others would help us to safety. But certain politicians are trying to turn us against people who come seeking safety, hoping we'll look the other way while they endanger families who've been forced to flee their homes. We won't fall for that. It's time to create a fair and effective asylum process for everyone and to support people to rebuild their lives in our communities. So there's more significant highs for the persuadables in this message than the other two. And everybody likes the phrase, but certain politicians are trying to turn us against those who come seeking safety. People do not like politicians. That came through quite strongly in this messaging. The low point is we won't fall for that. We need to understand why. We can't understand why from the research that we did. And it's important to note here, you can see right at the end, around 34 seconds, you can see that the opposition goes down while the base and the persuadables go up. And that's a really important finding because we're alienating the opposition, energizing the base and persuading the persuadables there. So this idea of supporting people to rebuild their lives in our community should be a central part of the way that we talk about refugees, because we know that we're bringing all of the people on side that we need to, and we're alienating the people that we need to when we say that. And finally, we use the race class message. And then the reason we call it the race class message is because the format of the message is inspired by the Race Class Narrative Project in the US. And the project that I'll be talking about in a minute is a sort of a British version of that project. And this is this one. So whatever our background or postcode, religion or race, we all deserve to live peacefully and free from harm. But today, a small group of politicians and their greedy friends hurt all our families by taking money out of our communities, running the NHS into the ground, and denying us fair pay for our work, all while pocketing the profits. They will do anything to distract us from their failures, encouraging us to blame refugees and migrants when things go wrong. While they do not care about us, we must show that we do care about one another. We need to come together to demand a fair and effective asylum system that allows those who need sanctuary to safely rebuild their lives in our communities. So this had more significant highs for the Persuadables than any other message. Again, the base and Persuadables dial sharply up at, but today a small group of politicians and their greedy friends hurt all our families. And we think that's because we're explaining why they're demonizing refugees. The base and Persuadables dial down when the messages discuss the specifics. We think that could be because people tend to always dial down in dial tests when the message goes negative, but it would be useful to understand whether that is what's happening here. So that's something for further research. And then the base and Persuadables go up again when we say, while they do not care about us, we must show that we do care about one another. So again, that value of care really works well. And again, we see the same thing as in the last message: support people to rebuild their lives in our communities. The base and the Persuadables really like it and the opposition doesn't like it. Again, reaffirming the fact that this is a phrase that really works for us. So we came up with some recommendations. So this is how. So at the moment, the way that communicators often format their messages is they start with a problem. They say, you know, refugees are being tortured, or whatever your issue might be. The economy is tanking. There's a war on women, you know. And we say, don't start with that. Because as Anat Shenker-Azorio says, who's the woman who trained me in communications, people got 99 problems and they don't want yours. So you shouldn't start with a problem. Instead, start with a shared value. What brings us together? What do we believe in? What kind of world do we want to live in? And then explain what or who is getting in the way of that value being realized. And then always assert a proactive solution. Because our enemy might be people. Everybody. Oh, hello. Sorry. I'll keep talking. There's questions at the end if there's a question. So our biggest enemy is not other politicians, is not other campaigners. Our biggest enemy is cynicism. People simply do not think that things can change. They like our ideas, but they don't believe that they're popular. Oh, sorry, that they're possible. Which is why we should always end our message with a proactive solution. And these are the principles. So we need to lead with the values of care and compassion when we're talking about refugees. But that's different from encouraging pity, because pity makes people think that refugees are not our equals, they're our subordinates. And when we talk about refugees experiencing graphic things like sexual abuse and torture, what we communicate to our audience is these people's life experiences are so different to yours that there's no way that you could possibly relate to them. So instead, talk about who refugees are as human beings. Don't frame the debate around legality. So don't sort of say that it's legal to claim asylum, because this is not a legal issue, this is a moral issue. And governments may change the law so that things that were previously legal become illegal. And then that confounds our whole argument. So we need to be focusing on morality and doing what's right and not what's legal. Point the finger at those responsible. So our asylum system is the way it is because people designed it and they can change it in any way that they want. Be comfortable with alienating the opposition. People do struggle with that. When you're a campaigner, to be told that you have to alienate some people can be quite difficult, but learn to be comfortable with that and create something good. So always remind people of how things can be better and get specific about that as well. And then we have some, I won't read all of these out, but we have some words on the left that campaigners are currently using, and we have words on the right which we think from our research and from other research that we've seen work better. You can see the full messaging guide that I wrote on Freedom from Torture's website, and I can send it to Ivan after this. You can circulate it as well. But yeah, that's the end.
Amazing. Thank you, Ellie. So just in case people have some burning questions, I thought we could throw out a couple. I also see one from Phoebe that I can read out. And in case there's any others, we'll create a little bit of space for it now. And then Ellie's going to present more on the current project on race and class. And then we'll have a more free-flowing introduction. So Phoebe asked, am I right in understanding that there is an increase in polarization in some of these points when there is an increase in base and the persuadables upward, let's say, and a decrease in sentiments from the opposition, which is kind of what also would happen if we're shifting more persuadables to agree with the base, and what's the standpoint on and your view on increasing polarization in the sense that the opposition gets alienated, which is an original point to all of this that is more unorthodox according to the we are all one narratives espoused by some campaigners. And I think Phoebe might want to add more, so I'm going to stop talking.
No, thanks, Ivan. Hi, Ellie. I just wanted to say hello because I work with Unbound, and I know that you also work with Unbound, and so we're very, very aware of your work, and really admire everything that you do. But just this point is really one that's at the core of the work I do, and also people like Alex Evans, is around kind of how do we decrease polarization, and I'm just constantly grappling with that in terms of how it sits with the kind of strategic communications angle and a lot of Anat's work around quite targeted communication, and in some of those graphs really seeing that increase of some of polarization maybe. So I just wanted to hear what are your thoughts, and maybe it's kicking off a larger discussion.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really glad that someone asked it. I like being asked this question because it's really important. So I think there's two answers to it really. The first answer is that our messaging doesn't happen in a blank space. It happens in a culture, and it happens in an environment where people who disagree with what we believe in, who aggressively oppose what we believe in, are using extremely polarizing messages themselves and are framing us as the enemy. And what we've learned from the race class project research that we've done is that if you are a character in the opposition story, which I guess in the British context, I'll just say the right, it's mainly the right. If you're a character in the right story, and the character that you're playing is you're the enemy, then basically if you can't engage with that in some way, what will end up happening is that they sort of run away with the narrative and win. And very often we portray ourselves as kind of observers because we don't want to sort of get down and dirty and start sort of really sort of scrapping it out. So often the way that we deal with that is we talk as though we're detached observers. And actually what that tends to do is leave us really vulnerable to being described in the way that the opposition wants to describe us. And then the second answer is to talk really about who the opposition are. So when we say opposition, we mean both the people in power who are pushing this narrative that is really damaging to refugee rights, but we also mean the small segment of the population who will never agree with us, no matter what we do, no matter what we say, and no matter who says it. And I think it's useful to sort of understand a bit more about those people, because I think there can be a confusion when you say, people who are opposed to refugee rights, we should be alienating them, because lots and lots of people are opposed to refugee rights. But what we find is the majority of people are opposed to refugee rights on Tuesday and they're in favor of them on Wednesday. So we're not saying you alienate people who have expressed anti-refugee sentiment, because most people at some point or another will do that, because we're living in a country where there's a lot of anti-refugee sentiment floating around. We're saying you oppose people who are every day of the week who are against refugees coming to this country, who read about it and get angry, who invest time in it, and who will go around to their family and friends trying to convince them to oppose refugee rights as well. So to give you an example, in order to be filtered into the opposition in this research, you would need to agree, firstly, that refugees should be shot on sight by border guards, and that the British state should be able to send children back to countries where they might be tortured. Because we wanted to be absolutely certain that the people that we were filtering into the opposition really, really didn't like refugees. So we asked them really extreme questions, because we thought only the very most opposed people will say yes to these questions. And actually only 12% of people did agree. So when you say, so it is polarizing, but I just want to re-emphasize the point that it's polarizing a very small population segment of the population against everybody else. And this segment of the population has very extreme views and has really made up their minds and will go around trying to convince other people to share their views. So I hope that sort of sheds some light.
And I'm glad you shared this, because I was also gonna ask a little bit about this categorization of how, like, some of these specific questions that get people into persuadables or opposition or base. And with those two really extreme questions of, you know, somebody being okay with people getting shot at a border or children being deported into precarious or life-threatening conditions, it really, that categorization lets you know what you can achieve in a conversation. And I think this is transferable to all kinds of contexts and topics, because if there is such a deviation between what I'm bringing into a conversation and where my standpoint is and my interlocutor, if we stand so far apart, it seems like it might be a huge waste of energy and resources to ever try and find common ground on this point. And since we do have finite time and energy, it's about where do we place it. And if this huge persuadables segment is so big, and oftentimes on many issues it is the largest segment of society, then this research sheds light on the importance of knowing who you're talking to and where people stand, so that you know what kind of outcome you can even hope to achieve. Otherwise, it might be just a foolish errand in the first place. So any other questions at this point? Great. Oh, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ellie. That was really interesting to have that sort of structure and framework put around the principles, but also to see the issues quantified in the way that you did, which is unusual and really useful. I was going to ask a question, because you said about these persuadables, you said they're always the majority, which I found really interesting. That figure of 64% in this issue, is that a large majority, or is that a sort of standard sort of size for the persuadables?
All of the figures in Britain are pretty standard. So the base is usually around 20-ish%. The opposition is usually between 10 and 15%. Obviously, this varies depending on country and issue, and then the persuadables tend to take up the rest. One difference to this was, this research was originally carried out by Anat Schenker-Osorio in Australia, and she supported me in carrying out this research. And in Australia, the opposition sample was 20%, which is huge. And the question that I'd only know one of the questions that they were asked to segment them into the opposition. And it was, do you think that it's right to detain people, including babies, as a sort of blanket policy? So yeah, Australia was in a really bad way in 2015 in terms of this issue. But they've made the refugee and migration sector in Australia has made enormous strides over the past 5 years, which I think is partly because of the sort of insurgent attitude that has developed in that sector as a result of this kind of research.
Thank you. If I may, just one other, which is probably more of an observation than a question. This is really interesting when you're putting our messaging side by side with the opposition's messaging to test their relative strength and their impact. I guess the issue for progressive messaging is that what tends to happen is that the opposition has much more access to platforms, higher visibility. Their message is repeated with much higher frequency than ours. So no matter how strong our messaging is, we're still up against the sheer weight of messaging from the other side.
That's definitely the case. I mean, that's undeniably the case. But I would say as well that, we have, despite all of that, despite the media being overwhelmingly in agreement with the opposition when it comes to refugees, for example, and our government in Britain as well, very opposed to refugees, we still found that 24% of people in this country agree with refugee rights in all circumstances, and 64% of people can be persuaded, which I think, given what they're hearing, is quite hopeful. And part of the work that I did for this research was I did a language analysis of the communications of the refugee and migration sector, and it was not good. So I'll give you some examples. So there was a real problem with speaking in a very dispassionate way. I called it patient diagnostics because it kind of felt like a doctor reading out a diagnosis to a patient, rather than talking about an emotive issue. We would often invoke what the government was saying and to deny it, which all that does really is sort of repeat the government's messages. And we didn't have really a sort of resonant story that we were telling about the country and about who we are as a nation, and how sort of refugee rights fits into how we see ourselves. So as much as I agree with you that the odds are, well, the system is stacked against us, that's undeniable. I still think that we haven't seen in the UK how well we could do, because our current communications is not as good as it could be.
Yeah, it was really interesting to watch what happened in Glasgow recently, because that showed the kind of country that Scotland wants to be with refugees, and you could measure how the impact that had on the opposition by how hard they were trying to position that community as a mob when it clearly wasn't. It was obviously quite frightening to the opposition to see that community spirit.
Yeah. And then you had the immigration raid, the PR immigration raid with Priti Patel a few days later. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We also have.
Thank you very much.
We have a question from Mira from Stay Grounded. Mira, go ahead.
Yes, thanks a lot, Ellie, for this really interesting presentation. And I really liked the point you made about, or I was wondering if that was actually the point you made about being clear in the words or the wording you use, because I found it really interesting using this safe and legal flight routes, that this is actually something that can be totally misinterpreted or wrongly understood. And I was just wondering if that was a case you made for being very precise in the wording, because sometimes I also have the feeling that it's good to have some words that leave space for the imagination or for different visions to fit in. So I was wondering if you can maybe say a bit more about that.
Yeah, great question. So there is a mistake that a lot of communicators make where they think that the public is divided into three categories: the base, the opposition, and then what they call the middle. And what they usually mean when they say that is that people are in the middle of these two extremes. So what that often means in terms of refugee rights is that they like some refugee rights, but not too much. And that completely misunderstands actually how most people engage with political issues. Because most people are busy going to work, feeding their children, paying their bills, they don't pay that much attention to politics, and they tend to absorb the messages that are happening around them. So instead of being in the middle of two extremes, they actually swing from one extreme to the other because these are the messages that they hear. And that's why we call them persuadables and not the middle. And I think the most important thing to know about persuadables is they like clarity and they like decisiveness. And they like that more than they like left-wing or right-wing messages. It's because they don't know what they think. They haven't really got time to sort of think in any depth about these issues because they're busy getting on with their lives, but also they don't really like politicians or politics because they find it alienating and irrelevant to them. So they're sort of looking, you know, around for a clear and decisive opinion that they can attach themselves to. And this sounds a bit silly, but the way I always think about it is I compare that to the way that I think about cricket, the sport cricket, because I'm not really very interested in cricket. I find it quite boring, no offense to anyone who likes cricket. But I know bits about it and I have some opinions about it, but it's not because I care about it. It's just because I've absorbed what other people have said around me or what I hear on the news sometimes. So if I was to be asked about cricket, I would say, I don't know, something like the Ashes, maybe, I don't know. But it wouldn't be something that I thought a lot about, you know. So for me, the way to understand persuadables is think about the thing in your own life that everyone else talks about, but that you're not particularly interested in. And think about how much you know about that and where you got that knowledge from and what the opinions that you have about that and where you got those opinions from. Usually you'll have absorbed them passively, they'll have been on the news, or you will have listened to what your family and friends are saying, and you will just have adopted that as your own because it's easier. Everybody does this, but we don't do it about politics because we care about politics and we work in politics. But most people do it about politics as well. So that's how I find when I want to understand how people think of a political issue, I think about how I understand cricket. So that's my tip with that one as well.